It all started with what seemed like an absolutely ridiculous idea that my wife, or rather now ex-wife, had at that time. One evening, she came up to me, her face filled with excitement, and said that one of her friends had told her about an opportunity for us to spend a week at a ranch. Apparently, this friend had connections, and she assured my wife that it could be a unique experience for us. The whole idea sounded a bit strange to me, so I asked, "What do you mean by a vacation? Are we supposed to go there and work?" I wasn't keen on spending my time off doing farm chores or something similar, and I wasn't afraid to make that clear. My wife laughed and assured me that it was nothing like that. She said it would be more of an excursion, living there for a week, observing animals, riding horses, and just enjoying life away from the city. She emphasized that this was a special deal, something we were getting only because of her friend's connections. To be honest, I wasn't too thrilled about it at first. I'm a straightforward man who likes clear plans, and this whole situation seemed a bit too vague for my liking. I asked her if we could really trust these people, considering they were strangers. My instinct is always to be cautious, especially when it involves going somewhere remote with people I don't know. But she just smiled and said, "You'll see. It'll be fine." The way she said it made it clear that she wasn't really interested in hearing my doubts, and I decided not to press the matter, at least not yet. A few days later, my wife invited her friend over to discuss the trip in more detail. I thought it was only reasonable to meet this person if I was supposed to trust her word. The friend seemed nice enough, though I could tell right away that she had an unusual air about her. She was one of those people who had a sort of restless energy, talking fast and constantly shifting from one topic to another. When I asked her about the ranch and what exactly we could expect, she assured me that it was all perfectly arranged. According to her, the woman who ran the ranch was a good friend of hers, although she did mention, almost in passing, that this friend was a bit eccentric. I didn't particularly like the sound of that, but I kept my opinion to myself. The more they talked about it, the more it felt like the whole thing was already decided, regardless of how I felt. My wife seemed genuinely excited, and her friend kept talking about how amazing and unique this opportunity was, something we wouldn't be able to experience under normal circumstances. I could tell they were both caught up in the idea, and I wasn't entirely comfortable being the only one raising concerns. At the same time, I wasn't about to just let it slide without making sure I knew what we were getting into. I asked a few more questions, like whether there would be anyone else there or if it was just going to be us. The friend assured me that it would be private, just for us, and that made me a bit more at ease. At least it wouldn't be crowded with strangers. The friend went on to explain more details about how we'd be able to see animals up close, interact with them, and even have the chance to ride horses. She said it would be an experience unlike anything we'd ever done before. I noticed how my wife's eyes lit up at the mention of horseback riding. It seemed to mean a lot to her, and I wasn't one to deny her something she clearly wanted so much. Still, I asked if there was anything we should be worried about. I wanted to make sure we weren't walking into some chaotic situation. The friend waved my concerns away, assuring me that everything would be perfectly organized, and that the ranch was a beautiful, peaceful place. The following days were spent preparing for the trip. My wife was in high spirits, talking about what we should pack and making plans for what we would do once we got there. I mostly kept to myself, listening and nodding along, though I couldn't shake the feeling that this whole thing might end up being more trouble than it was worth. Still, I'd given my word, and once I agree to something, I follow through. Eventually, we set a date, and everyone seemed ready to go. In the end, we all agreed to take this leap, hoping it would turn out to be the adventure they promised it would be. A week later, we all met up, ready for the trip. I had taken time off from work, and so had my wife. We packed our bags, and I couldn't help but notice the stark difference between our luggage. My things fit neatly into a single backpack, while my wife had a massive suitcase for herself. I found it amusing and couldn't resist making a little joke about it. "You do realize we're not heading to a luxury resort, right? It's probably going to be muddy, and everything will stink of animals," I said, trying to keep the tone light. My wife just rolled her eyes and reiterated, for what felt like the 10th time, that we were going there to relax, not to work. I let it go. There wasn't much point in arguing over it. we picked up her friend, who would be joining us, and headed off to the ranch. When we finally arrived, we were greeted by the friend of my wife's friend, the one who worked at the ranch. She wasted no time in showing us to our accommodations. To my surprise, we were taken to what was essentially a barn, a hayloft, to be exact. There were neat little beds set up in the hay, and while it wasn't exactly luxury, I had to admit there was something charming about the simplicity of it. The summer heat was almost overwhelming, but the rustic setting seemed fitting, given where we were. My wife, on the other hand, looked less than impressed. I could see the skepticism on her face, and I decided to lighten the mood. "This is all part of the experience," I told her, trying to sound as enthusiastic as I could. She didn't seem convinced, but at least she didn't argue. After we got settled, our guide, the friend who worked there, took us on a tour of the ranch. She was clearly passionate about the place, and I couldn't help but notice how much she talked about the animals. It wasn't just the usual talk of feeding or caring for them, she spoke of them almost as if they were people. She told us about each horse by name, recounting stories of their behavior and quirks. One particular story caught me off guard. She mentioned that one of the horses had replaced her husband after he passed away. I raised an eyebrow at that, trying to hide my surprise. I couldn't help but wonder what exactly she meant by that. My wife shot me a warning glance, as if to say, "Don't you dare make a comment," so I kept my mouth shut, though my curiosity remained. We continued walking around, seeing the different parts of the ranch, the stables, the pastures, the small garden where they grew vegetables. It was a lot to take in, and while I wasn't exactly thrilled about the whole idea initially, I had to admit that there was something peaceful about the place. The animals seemed well cared for, and there was a sense of routine that I could appreciate. The friend working there kept up her commentary, explaining how things operated and what we could expect during our stay. She was clearly knowledgeable, though I couldn't shake the feeling that she was just a bit too attached to the animals. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing, just different. Later that day, as the sun began to set, we gathered for dinner. It was a simple meal, but it felt fitting for the setting. We all sat around a large wooden table, and I noticed how the atmosphere seemed to shift as the evening went on. The conversation flowed easily, mostly focused on the ranch, the animals, and what we could expect in the coming days. I didn't say much, preferring to listen and take it all in. The friend who worked there dominated the conversation, once again talking at length about the animals. She had a way of making everything about them, whether it was the way they interacted with each other or the roles they played on the ranch. My wife seemed interested, nodding along, while I mostly kept my thoughts to myself. At one point, the friend brought up an upcoming visitor. She said there would be someone else joining us soon, and she made a point of telling us not to be too alarmed by him. Apparently, this person had a penchant for joking around, and she warned us to be on our guard. I wasn't quite sure what to make of that. It seemed a bit odd to me to warn guests about someone before they even arrived, but I decided not to read too much into it. My wife's friend seemed unfazed, and my wife herself just nodded, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. I, however, couldn't help but wonder what kind of jokes we were supposed to be prepared for. The friend went on to elaborate a bit, saying that this person was known for his unpredictable sense of humor and that he loved to surprise people. I wasn't exactly thrilled to hear that. I like things to be straightforward, and surprises aren't exactly my idea of fun, especially not when I'm in an unfamiliar place surrounded by people I don't really know. But I decided to keep my thoughts to myself for the time being. After all, we were here now, and I wasn't about to start complaining right away. Besides, I figured it might not be as bad as she made it sound. Maybe it was just her way of preparing us for someone who was a bit more eccentric than usual. As dinner wrapped up, I could tell that my wife was still excited about the whole experience, and that, more than anything, kept me from voicing my concerns. She deserved this time away, and if it meant dealing with a few odd characters along the way, then so be it. The friend who worked there seemed genuinely invested in making sure we had a good time, and I figured that was worth something. We finished our meal, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air finally started to cool. I looked around at the others, all chatting and laughing, and decided that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be as strange as I initially thought. As the night fell and we prepared to settle in, I couldn't help but notice the strong scent of hay that filled the entire space. It was different from anything I was used to, a combination of earthiness and something almost comforting. It wasn't what I would call pleasant, but it had its own charm. We lay down on our makeshift beds in the hayloft, and as I looked around, I realized that this was definitely far from what I expected when my wife suggested our vacation. I tried to push away my thoughts and make the best of it, but something about the whole setup made me uneasy. I turned to my wife and commented, "These people are definitely unusual." Especially that bit about the horse replacing her husband. There was something there that didn't sit right with me. I didn't mean to sound judgmental, but I was genuinely puzzled. My wife frowned at my comment and gave me a disapproving look. "That's not fair," she said, her voice low but firm. "Talking about her late husband like that, it's just disrespectful." I shrugged, not really wanting to argue. It wasn't like I was trying to insult the woman, it was just strange to me. I didn't say anything more, knowing that pushing the subject would just make things worse. She turned away, and I could tell that she was annoyed, but I wasn't about to apologize for pointing out something that made me uncomfortable. We were in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by people I didn't know, and I wasn't going to ignore my instincts just to avoid a disagreement. As we lay there in the dim light, trying to get comfortable on the beds of hay, the conversation took a different turn. My wife's friend, who had been quiet up until that point, suddenly chimed in. She started complaining about how uncomfortable the sleeping arrangements were and how she doubted she'd get any rest at all. Her complaints were almost amusing, especially considering that she had been so enthusiastic about the trip earlier. I couldn't help but smirk at her change in attitude. It wasn't long, though, before her complaints turned into curiosity about the mysterious person who was supposed to join us. She seemed genuinely intrigued, and the way she spoke about it made me think she knew more than she was letting on. After a few minutes, my wife's friend seemed to drop her complaints entirely and instead began to speculate about the identity of the mysterious person. It was almost as if her discomfort had been forgotten entirely. She spoke with such energy that it became almost comical. She mentioned that it might be the brother of the woman who worked at the ranch, someone she hadn't seen in years. Apparently, he worked on a different ranch, though she never quite explained why. It was clear that there was some kind of story there, but she danced around the details. I listened quietly, trying to piece together what little information she provided, but it wasn't much to go on. The way she talked about him made it seem like he was some kind of enigma, someone with a past that nobody really understood. At one point, my wife's friend began reminiscing about the brother of the woman who worked at the ranch, about how they used to play together as kids and how he always had a wild streak. She spoke with a mix of fondness and exasperation, describing how he would always get them into trouble. It was clear that she cared about him, but there was also a hint of worry in her voice. She mentioned that he had always been a bit unpredictable, and that was part of the reason why no one really knew what he was up to now. My wife listened intently, clearly fascinated by the story. I, on the other hand, was starting to feel like this was more information than I needed. The more I heard, the more I felt like this person might be more trouble than he was worth. Eventually, the conversation began to wind down, and the exhaustion of the day caught up with us. It was nearly 3 a.m. by the time we finally decided to call it a night. My wife's friend had talked herself hoarse, and even my wife seemed ready to get some sleep. I lay back, closing my eyes and trying to block out the lingering thoughts that still nagged at me. There was something about this place that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but for now, I was too tired to care. We all settled into our makeshift beds, and within minutes, the loft was filled with the sound of slow, even breathing as we drifted off to sleep. The next morning, we were awakened early by the sound of someone calling out to us, urging us to get up. It was time for breakfast, and after that, we would be heading out for a ride on the horses. The sun was already high, and the heat of the summer day was beginning to settle in. We gathered ourselves, shook off the drowsiness, and headed out to join everyone for a simple breakfast. The mood was light, and the conversation centered around the day's plans. As we ate, I turned to my wife's friend and asked her, "So, is it going to be your brother joining us today?" She nodded, confirming my assumption. There was a hint of something in her eyes, maybe excitement, maybe apprehension, but I didn't dwell on it. After breakfast, we made our way towards the stables. As we approached, I saw him for the first time. He was standing near the horse paddock, tall and seemingly confident. At first glance, there was nothing particularly strange about him. He looked like an ordinary ranch worker, dressed in worn-out jeans and a faded shirt, his hands resting comfortably on the fence as he watched the horses. The way he held himself gave off an air of familiarity with the place, but I could sense something else underneath, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. We all greeted each other, and he seemed polite enough, his smile easy and casual. He offered to help my wife's friend get up on her horse, and she accepted, climbing onto the fence so he could give her a boost. Just as he was helping her into the saddle, the atmosphere shifted abruptly. From across the paddock, an old man, clearly someone in charge, came storming over, his voice raised in anger. He shouted at the young man, his tone dripping with frustration, "Get away from that horse. How many times do I have to tell you? Haven't you learned by now?" The sudden outburst caught all of us off guard. The young man quickly stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. He mumbled an apology, his expression a mix of embarrassment and irritation, and then hurried away without another word. The old man, realizing that we were all watching, gave us an awkward nod before turning and leaving as quickly as he'd arrived. The tension in the air lingered, and I could feel the curiosity bubbling inside me. Once the commotion had settled, I asked what that was all about. The young man's sister, the one who worked at the ranch, looked uncomfortable, clearly unsure of how to respond. Before she could say anything, her brother, who had now returned, albeit looking slightly sheepish, spoke up. He explained, in a casual tone that seemed almost rehearsed, that it all stemmed from something that happened when he was younger. Apparently, he had been messaging his then-girlfriend late at night, and she had mentioned wanting to be swept off her feet by a prince on a white horse. In an impulsive attempt to impress her, he had stolen one of the horses from the ranch in the middle of the night. They had gone for a ride, but things hadn't gone as planned. The horse threw them both off, then bolted into the darkness. They had searched for it, but it was never found. His father, furious over the incident, had banned him from being near the horses, which was why he had ended up working at another ranch. The story, while told with a certain light-heartedness, left me with an uneasy feeling. The fact that he had stolen a horse just to impress someone, and then lost it, seemed irresponsible at best. It made me wonder whether there was more to the story, something he wasn't telling us. My wife's friend seemed embarrassed, her gaze fixed on the ground as her brother spoke. The young man, on the other hand, seemed almost proud of his actions, as if it was some grand adventure rather than a mistake that had cost the ranch a valuable animal. I couldn't help but feel a pang of concern as he continued to talk, his tone growing more animated as he described the escapade. It was clear that he didn't see anything wrong with what he'd done, and that bothered me. Despite the awkwardness of the situation, we eventually moved on, preparing for the ride ahead. We each chose a horse, and the young man, despite his supposed restrictions, was there to help us get ready. He spoke about the horses with a strange intensity, describing their personalities and how to handle them. There was something about the way he spoke that made me uncomfortable. He compared the horses to women, talking about how they needed to be tamed and understood. The way he spoke, it was almost as if he was implying something more, something inappropriate. My wife seemed unfazed by his words, but I couldn't help but feel a knot forming in my stomach. The way he patted the horses, the way his hands lingered just a bit too long, set off alarms in my mind. Eventually, we finished the ride and returned to the stables. The young man dismounted and began helping everyone else down from their horses, his hands lingering just a bit too long as he assisted my wife and her friend. I watched, my jaw clenched, as he smiled and made small talk, his eyes lingering on them in a way that made my skin crawl. I wanted to say something, to call him out on his behavior, but I held back. We were guests here, and I didn't want to cause a scene, not yet, anyway. Instead, I focused on getting my horse settled, keeping a close eye on him the entire time. Once everything was done, we headed back to the hayloft to rest. The day had been long, and the heat had taken its toll on all of us. My wife and her friend were still chatting, their spirits high from the ride, while I remained quiet, my thoughts focused on the young man and his strange behavior. There was something about him that didn't sit right with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of his antics. For now, though, it was time to rest. We were all exhausted, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, we settled in for the night, hoping that tomorrow would bring a more straightforward day. After all the riding and the strange interactions, sleep came easily, and soon the hayloft was filled with the soft sounds of people drifting off, the day's events fading into the quiet of the night. It was only the second day, but I could feel that something was off. Later in the afternoon, I brought up the subject of that young man again. There was something about him that just didn't sit well with me. I turned to my wife and made a comment about how strange the whole situation was. Sure, the day had been enjoyable, but the things that Guy said, the way he acted around the horses, it all made me uneasy. My wife, of course, didn't see it the same way. She brushed it off as me overreacting. "Maybe you're just reading too much into it," she said, her tone light. Her friend chimed in, agreeing, and even joking that maybe I was the one with a strange perspective. I shook my head, trying to ignore their laughter, and insisted that there was something wrong there. But eventually, I let it drop, knowing that continuing the argument wouldn't get me anywhere. The rest of the evening passed quietly enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The others seemed to be enjoying themselves, laughing and talking as if nothing had happened, while I kept my thoughts to myself. By the time night fell, I started to feel physically off as well. A wave of fatigue washed over me, and I could feel the telltale signs of a fever setting in. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking maybe it was just the heat of the day catching up with me, but it wasn't long before I knew that I was actually getting sick. My wife noticed my discomfort and asked if I was okay, and I reluctantly admitted that I wasn't feeling great. They suggested that maybe I should head back home if I was feeling unwell. It wasn't the worst idea, but there was no way I was going to leave them here alone. Not with that guy hanging around. I told them as much, saying, "No, I'll stay. I brought you here, and I'll make sure to get you back." My wife gave me a skeptical look but didn't push the matter any further. I could see that she was concerned, but she knew me well enough to understand that I wasn't going to change my mind. So, I stayed put, trying to rest and hoping that whatever this was would pass quickly. The last thing I wanted was to spend the rest of this trip laid up and useless. Later in the evening, the woman who worked at the ranch came by to check on me. She took one look at me and said I needed something to help bring down the fever. She disappeared for a few minutes and came back with a mug of something steaming. She handed it to me and said it was tea with goat fat. I looked at the mug skeptically, the oily surface shimmering in the dim light. She insisted it was an old remedy that would help, and I figured I didn't have much to lose, so I took a sip. The taste was as bad as I expected, and it took everything in me not to gag. The others couldn't help but laugh at the face I made, and even I had to admit it was pretty awful. But if it worked, I'd be grateful. Just as I was trying to get through the tea, the young man, the brother, showed up. He walked in with his usual confident swagger, and immediately the atmosphere shifted. He looked at the women and said, "All right, ladies, come with me. I'm about to show you some sizes you've never seen before." His tone was playful, but there was something about the way he said it that rubbed me the wrong way. I narrowed my eyes, trying to figure out what he meant. "What sizes?" I asked, my tone sharp. He glanced back at me with a grin and said, "The bulls. We're going to go see the bulls. Maybe I'll even show them a little red cloth, give you a show." The women seemed intrigued, exchanging glances before getting up to follow him. I watched them go, a knot of irritation forming in my chest. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, that made me want to tell him to back off. But I held my tongue, knowing that starting something now wouldn't do any good. Instead, I stayed where I was, sipping at the disgusting tea and trying to focus on anything other than the unease that seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute. Once they left, the place felt eerily quiet. The only sounds were the faint rustling of the hay and the distant noises of the animals outside. I leaned back, trying to make myself comfortable and hoping that the tea would start working soon. I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have gone with them, but my body felt too heavy, too weak to move. I wasn't in any condition to be of much help to anyone right now, and that only made the irritation grow. I hated feeling this useless, especially here, in a place that already made me uneasy. I took another sip of the tea, forcing it down despite the awful taste. It wasn't just the fever that had me on edge. It was everything, the strange behavior of the young man, the way my wife seemed to brush off my concerns, the fact that I was now stuck here feeling like I was falling apart. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this powerless, and I didn't like it one bit. I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself that it was just the fever making everything seem worse. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. There was something wrong here, and I wasn't about to ignore it. So, I stayed put, lying back in the hay, the mug of tea resting in my hands. I could hear faint laughter in the distance, the sound of my wife and her friend with that guy, and it made my skin crawl. I wanted to get up, to follow them and make sure everything was okay, but my body refused to cooperate. Instead, I closed my eyes, taking slow, measured breaths, and tried to convince myself that they'd be fine. For now, all I could do was lie there, sipping on that awful tea, and wait for whatever came next. Later that evening, my wife returned, her face flushed with excitement. She wasted no time in telling me about the young man and how charming he was. She described how he had been showing off with the bull earlier, his agility and confidence impressing everyone who watched. She said that he had promised to stop by later in the night to give us some sort of performance. The way she spoke about him made me uneasy. I could feel the tension in my chest as she went on, and I finally interrupted her. "Isn't he taking a bit too much on himself?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. She looked at me with a raised eyebrow and, with a slight smirk, asked, "What, are you jealous?" I didn't bother denying it. "Yes, actually," I replied. "He's drawing way too much attention to himself, especially from you. And what's the deal with these nighttime performances? What's he planning to do, exactly?" My wife rolled her eyes, clearly amused by my reaction. "Come on," she said, "it's just a bit of fun. You don't need to make a big deal out of it." I could feel my irritation growing, but before I could say anything more, there was a knock on the door, and the young man himself appeared, accompanied by my wife's friend, who seemed equally eager to see whatever he had in store. The young man greeted us with his usual confident smile, his eyes lingering on my wife for just a moment longer than I liked. He didn't waste any time, urging the women to come with him to some place he had prepared. My wife's friend was already by his side, and my wife gave me a quick glance before following them. I didn't like it, not one bit, but I knew that arguing now wouldn't do any good. So, I stayed where I was, watching as they left the room, my unease only growing stronger. Once they were gone, I tried to focus on anything else, but it was no use. The whole situation felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. A few minutes later, the young man returned alone. He walked in casually, as if he owned the place, and looked at me with that same smug grin. "Not bored here all by yourself?" he asked, his tone dripping with mock concern. I narrowed my eyes, already tired of his games. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice flat. He didn't seem to care about my answer, though. Instead, he stepped closer, leaning against the wall and crossing his arms as he looked around the room. There was a moment of silence before he spoke again, his voice lower this time, almost conspiratorial. "You know," he said, "you have a really beautiful wife. If I were in your shoes, I think I'd be losing my mind right about now." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel my jaw clench as I looked at him, trying to keep my temper in check. "What are you trying to say?" I asked, my voice cold. He just smiled, that infuriating smile that made my skin crawl, and shook his head. "Nothing," he said, his tone light. "Just thought I'd check in on you, see how you were doing." He pushed himself away from the wall and turned to leave, his steps unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. I watched him go, my hands balled into fists at my sides. There was something about him that made every instinct in me scream that he was trouble, but for now, there wasn't much I could do. I stayed where I was, my thoughts racing. The audacity of the guy was unbelievable. The way he spoke about my wife, the way he seemed to think he could just waltz in here and say whatever he wanted without any consequences, it made my blood boil. But I knew that confronting him now wouldn't get me anywhere. He thrived on provoking others, on getting under people's skin, and I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose my cool. Instead, I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now, I had to play it smart. A little later, my wife and her friend returned, laughing as they entered the room. I could feel my irritation building again. The whole situation with that young man was really starting to get under my skin, and I couldn't stay silent about it any longer. I turned to my wife and said, "It looks like you've really gotten under his skin. I think it's best if you stop interacting with him until I get back on my feet." My tone was serious, and I could see the laughter vanish from her face. She stared at me, incredulous. "What the hell are you talking about?" she asked, her voice filled with irritation. I held my ground, refusing to back down. "Can't you see what he's doing? He's making moves on you, and he's only doing it because I'm not in a position to stop him right now. He's taking advantage of the situation," I said, my voice calm but firm. My wife rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed with my assessment. "That's nonsense," she snapped. "You're just being paranoid. Maybe if you'd get better sooner, you'd see that there's nothing going on." She was clearly frustrated, and her friend looked equally annoyed, as if I was the one causing all the problems here. I knew I wasn't going to convince her, not in the state she was in. She was too caught up in the excitement of being here, too blinded by the novelty of it all to see what was really happening. I didn't like it, but there wasn't much I could do about it at the moment. She looked at me, her eyes narrowed, and said, "Listen, we're only here for a couple more days. Can you just try to have some sense and not turn into some controlling jerk?" The word stung, but I tried not to let it show. I knew she was frustrated, but I also knew that I was right about this guy. I wasn't imagining things, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Despite the tension between us, my wife and her friend were soon back to their cheerful selves. They mentioned that the woman who worked at the ranch had called them over for something, and before I could say anything more, they were heading out again. I watched them leave, feeling a mix of frustration and helplessness. I wanted to be the one to protect her, to make sure she was safe, but in my current state, there was little I could do. I hated feeling this powerless, and the fact that she didn't seem to take my concerns seriously only made it worse. I could hear their laughter as they walked away, and it grated on my nerves. After they left, the room felt empty and cold. I lay back, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was right about that young man, that he was playing some kind of game and using my absence to get closer to my wife. The worst part was, I couldn't be there to stop it. I felt trapped, lying there with a fever, unable to act while everything seemed to be falling apart around me. My instincts told me that something was wrong, and I had never been one to ignore my instincts. But for now, all I could do was wait and hope that she would come to her senses before it was too late. Despite everything, I still felt pretty awful. The fever hadn't let up, and my energy was almost non-existent. My body ached, my head throbbed, and I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do much until I recovered. It was a frustrating feeling, knowing that I couldn't act, couldn't protect my wife the way I wanted to. But I wasn't going to give up. I was determined to get through this, to get back on my feet and take control of the situation. For now, though, all I could do was wait, my frustration simmering as I lay there, feeling as if time had come to a standstill. I must have dozed off at some point, the exhaustion finally getting the better of me. My sleep was restless, filled with disjointed images and a sense of unease that never seemed to go away. It wasn't long before I was abruptly awakened by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground below. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding, and instinctively leaned over the edge of the hayloft to see what was going on. What I saw made me freeze. There, lying on the ground, was my wife, still fully clothed, but covered from head to toe in some sort of thick white liquid. The smell hit me almost immediately. It was a pungent mix of alcohol and something else I couldn't quite identify. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. What the hell happened here? I muttered to myself, my gut churning with unease. I made my way to the stables, each step feeling heavier than the last. The closer I got, the clearer the noises became, laughter, whispers, the unmistakable sounds of something intimate. I pushed open the door just a crack, peering inside, and what I saw made my stomach turn. There, in the dim light of the stable, was the young man, the brother, with my wife's friend. They were tangled together, their movements shameless, and as if that wasn't enough, they were both reaching out, touching one of the horses, their hands moving over its body in a way that made my blood run cold. It was twisted, something out of a nightmare, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. For a moment, I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Then, almost mechanically, I reached for my phone. I didn't know what else to do. I needed proof, something to show that this wasn't just some fever-induced hallucination. My hands were shaking as I hit the record button, the screen lighting up as I captured every sickening detail. The young man's laughter, the way they moved, the way they touched the horse, it was all there, recorded in stark, undeniable clarity. I felt a mix of rage and disbelief, my heart pounding in my ears as I stood there, hidden in the shadows, watching. I don't know how long I stood there, my phone held up, my body tense. It felt like an eternity, each second stretching on as I watched them. Finally, when I had seen enough, I stopped the recording and slipped away, my stomach churning with disgust. I needed to get back to my wife, to figure out what had happened to her. I retraced my steps, my mind racing, the images from the stable replaying over and over again. The further I got from the stables, the angrier I became. This was beyond anything I could have imagined, and I knew that there was no going back from this. Whatever was happening here, it was far worse than I had thought. When I returned to where my wife was lying, she hadn't moved. She was still covered in that thick, white liquid, the smell of alcohol clinging to her like a cloud. I knelt beside her again, my eyes scanning her body for any sign of injury, anything that could explain what had happened. It was then that I noticed her phone, half buried beneath her arm. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the screen. What I found made my heart drop. There were videos of her, of that young man, of the others. It was all there, the evidence of what had been happening behind my back. I felt a cold fury settle in my chest, my vision blurring as I scrolled through the footage, each clip worse than the last. With shaking hands, I sent the videos to my own phone, making sure I had a copy of everything. I knew what I had to do, and there was no time to waste. I stood up, looking down at my wife for a moment, my mind racing. The person I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I couldn't even begin to understand. I turned away, grabbing my backpack with my belongings and heading for the car. I wasn't going to stay here another second. I left her there, lying on the ground, and I left her friend as well. There was no explanation, no goodbye, I was done. I drove away, the anger and betrayal swirling inside me, the road ahead blurry as I tried to make sense of everything that had happened. The drive home felt like it took forever, but at the same time, I couldn't even remember most of it. My mind was a haze of emotions, anger, disgust, disbelief. I kept replaying the images in my head, the videos, the things I had seen. By the time I got home, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to let her back into my life, not after everything she had done. I walked into the house and immediately started gathering everything I could. I collected all the cash I had hidden away, all the emergency savings, and transferred the rest of the money from our joint accounts to my personal one. There was no way I was leaving anything for her. Once I had secured the money, I went to the garage and found the old set of locks I had kept from when we first moved in. It was late, but I didn't care. I spent the next few hours replacing every lock in the house. The front door, the back door, even the windows. I wasn't going to take any chances. By the time I was finished, it was well past midnight, and I was exhausted. But it didn't matter. I had done what needed to be done. I took the new keys, put them in my pocket, and locked the door behind me. This was my house now, she had no place here anymore. Morning came sooner than I expected, and with it came the inevitable. My wife showed up, banging on the door, her voice loud and demanding. I could hear her through the door, shouting my name, asking what the hell I was doing and why I had left her there. I ignored her at first, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened to her pounding on the door. She called my phone, and I let it ring a few times before finally picking up. "What are you doing?" "Let me in," she shouted, her voice filled with anger and confusion. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's going to be a surprise for you," I said, my words clipped. And with that, I hung up, walking to the bedroom to gather her things. I didn't hold back. I grabbed all of her clothes, her shoes, everything she had left in the house, and started throwing it out the window. Piece by piece, I tossed it all onto the lawn, the pile growing as I worked. I could hear her outside, her voice rising as she realized what I was doing. She started screaming, demanding that I stop, but I didn't listen. This was my way of showing her that I was done, that there was no coming back from what she had done. She had made her choices, and now she was going to live with the consequences. I kept going until there was nothing left of hers inside the house, my anger fueling every movement. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash from the back of the house. I rushed to see what had happened, my heart pounding. She had taken a stone and shattered the glass of the back door, forcing her way inside. I stood there, stunned for a moment as she stumbled through the door, her eyes wild with anger. "What the hell are you doing?" she screamed, her voice echoing through the house. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. She had actually broken into the house, as if she still had any right to be here. My shock quickly turned to anger, and I stepped forward, my voice cold. "How dare you?" I said, my hands trembling. "After everything you've done, you think you can just come back here?" She looked at me, her expression shifting from anger to something else, something almost like fear. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice cracking. I took out my phone, opening the videos, and held it up for her to see. "I saw everything," I said, my voice low. "I know what you did. I saw you with him, with the others. I know what you've been doing behind my back." Her face went pale, her eyes widening as she looked at the screen. For a moment, there was silence, the reality of the situation sinking in. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I could see the panic in her eyes, the realization that there was no way out of this. I stepped closer, my voice steady as I spoke. "You're done here. Get out. I don't want to see you again." She tried to protest, her voice shaky, but I wasn't listening. I pointed to the door, my anger boiling over. "Get out," I repeated, my voice louder this time. "We're done. I'm filing for divorce, and I don't want you anywhere near me or this house again." She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears, but I didn't care. There was no sympathy left in me, no forgiveness. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I watched as she turned, stumbling towards the door, her shoulders slumped. I followed her, making sure she left, and as the door closed behind her, I felt a sense of finality. It was over. She was gone, and I was finally free. Later, I found myself in the courtroom, facing what was left of the relationship that had fallen apart so violently. I had all the evidence I needed, the videos, the messages, everything that had happened at the ranch. The footage spoke louder than any words I could have said. It showed the betrayal, the depravity, and the truth of what had been happening behind my back. My lawyer presented it all, piece by piece, while I sat there, the anger still simmering inside me but controlled. I watched my wife as the reality of her actions was laid out in front of everyone. She couldn't deny it, not with everything right there for the judge to see. In the end, the decision was clear. I was awarded the divorce, full separation of assets, and a restraining order to keep her away from me. It was a small victory, but it was a step towards finally putting this nightmare behind me. Once the court case was settled, I turned my attention to the young man, the brother. I couldn't just let him get away with everything he had done, not after what I'd seen. I did some digging and eventually found out where he was working. It was another ranch, not too far away. I wasn't about to let him continue his twisted behavior without consequences. I compiled all the videos that involved him, the ones that showed exactly what kind of person he was. It was sickening to watch it all again, but I knew it had to be done. I sent everything to the owners of the ranch where he worked, along with a warning. I told them to watch out, to be careful, because if he could do what he did at one place, he could do it there too. I wasn't sure what kind of response to expect, or if they would even believe me. But I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. The thought of him being around more animals, more people who had no idea what he was capable of, made my skin crawl. I knew I had to at least try to prevent him from hurting anyone else. A few weeks passed, and I finally received a response. It was a formal letter from the ranch, thanking me for bringing the situation to their attention. They had reviewed the footage and taken it seriously. They informed me that the young man no longer worked there and that they had taken additional steps to ensure the safety of their animals. The letter also mentioned that they had filed a report with the authorities for animal cruelty using the evidence I had provided. It was more than I had hoped for. It meant that there was a chance he would finally face some real consequences for his actions, that he wouldn't be able to just move on to another place and continue what he was doing. It was a small measure of justice, but it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Knowing that he wouldn't be able to harm any more animals, at least not without repercussions, gave me some sense of closure. I knew that this whole ordeal wasn't something I would forget anytime soon. The betrayal, the lies, the things I had seen, they would stay with me. But I also knew that I had done everything I could to make things right, to protect others from the same kind of pain. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase what had happened, but it was enough for now. I had taken back control of my life, and I had made sure that those who had wronged me faced the consequences of their actions. As I put the letter away, I felt a sense of finality. The chapter was closing, and while the scars would remain, I was ready to move forward. I had faced the truth, taken action, and come out the other side. The people who had hurt me were no longer a part of my life, and I intended to keep it that way. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I could finally breathe again, free from the lies, the betrayal, and the darkness that had consumed my life for far too long.